Anyway, a little Bible background. Today we are going to hear two stories of wildly extravagant compassion. The first is one of the least known of the gospel stories, and the other, as Amy pointed out, is one of the best known of all the stories in the whole Bible. The story from Mark takes place in the last week of Jesus' life. It appears in all four Gospels in slightly different ways. In three of them, it takes place at a house in Bethany, which was like a suburb of Jerusalem, where Jesus stayed when he was in Jerusalem that last week. An unnamed woman pours oil on Jesus' head, which is a symbolic way of preparing him for burial. In other words, she gets him. She understands what he's about, what he's going to be doing, what's going to be done to him in the next few days. Do you notice how Jesus praises her? And yet, we don't even know her name. Listen for that in the story. I've preached about that before, and I will again, but that's not the point of our message today. The oil she uses is imported from the Himalayas. Very expensive. Since a denarius equaled about a day's wages, if you figure she got a day off a week, that's just about a year's income that she pours on Jesus' head. Can you imagine? People got angry. What a waste. She should have sold this perfume and given the money to the poor. And Jesus replies, she has done a beautiful thing. What she has done will be told in memory of her. You will always have the poor with you. And this is a phrase that's been used through the centuries to justify Christian complacence. Kurt Vonnegut once got a chance to preach, and he picked that line because he said so much unchristian impatience with the poor has come out of that line. He offered his own translation. He imagines Jesus really trying to say, don't worry about that right now. There will still be plenty of poor people to help after I'm gone. Krister Stendahl used this passage to teach that we always have to pay attention to the context in a reading. He said, when Jesus said the poor will always be with you, he did not say it to a hungry person. Now, the story we call the Good Samaritan would have blown the minds of the people who heard it at the time. You would not use good and Samaritan in the same sentence if you were a good Jewish person of the day. They were just not words that belonged together. Samaritans were sworn enemies of the Jewish people, considered mixed race and impure. Samaria lay in between Galilee to the north and Jerusalem more to the south. And if you were traveling between the two of them, you would take a big detour so you wouldn't have to go through Samaria. Jesus' world had more social levels than any school playground or lunchroom, any workplace politics you've ever gotten ensnarled in. There were written lists of who was at the top of the cleanliness list and who was at the bottom. At the top of this list were lawyers, which is another word for Torah scholar, like the fellow asking Jesus the question in the first place. Also at the top were the priests and the Levites, who will also show up in the telling of the story. Down at the bottom, among others, were innkeepers, because inns were dangerous and dirty places. You didn't go to an inn unless you didn't have available family or social connections. Samaritans were so unclean, they didn't even make the list at all. Now, with these characters and their social situations in mind, I invite you to listen to the stories with fresh ears.
The parable of the Good Samaritan. Just then a lawyer stood up to test Jesus. "Teacher," he said, "what must I do to inherit eternal life?" Jesus said to the lawyer, "What is written in the law? What do you read there?" The lawyer answered, "You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus said to the lawyer, "You have given the right answer. Do this, and you will live." But wanting to justify himself, the lawyer asked Jesus, "And who is my neighbor?" Jesus replied, "A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho and fell into the hands of robbers who stripped him, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Now by chance a priest was going down that road, and when he saw the beaten man, the priest passed by on the other side. So likewise a Levite, when he came to the place and saw the man, the Levite passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, while traveling, came near the beaten man, and when the Samaritan saw him, the Samaritan was moved with pity. He went to the man and bandaged his wounds, having poured oil and wine on them. Then he put him on his own animal, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. And the next day he took out 2 denarii, gave them to the innkeeper, and said, 'Take care of him. And when I come back, I will repay you whatever money you have spent.' Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers?" The lawyer said, "The one who showed him mercy." And Jesus said to him, "Go and do likewise." In the gospel reading from Mark. It was 2 days before the Passover and the festival of the unleavened bread. The chief priests and scribes were looking for a way to arrest Jesus by stealth and kill him. For they said, "Not during the festival, or there may be a riot among the people." While Jesus was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he sat at the table, a woman came with an alabaster jar, a very costly ointment of nard, and she broke open the jar and poured the ointment on his head. But some were there who said to one another in anger, "Why was the ointment wasted in this way? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii, and the money given to the poor," and they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Let her alone. Why do you trouble her? For she has performed a good service for me. For you always have the poor with you, and you can show kindness to them whenever you like. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for its burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the good news is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in remembrance of her." May God bless the reading and the hearing and the doing of the word.
I'm wondering if you're calling to mind right now a Good Samaritan story. A story of your own of unexpected, extravagant love given or received, maybe to or from a very unlikely source. Our Lenten sermons are exploring fierce love, based on the book by the same name, written by the Reverend Dr. Jackie Lewis of Marble Collegiate Church in New York. She tells a story from her 20s, when she was newly married, didn't have much money, traveling with her husband from, somewhere toward upstate New York to Louisville for a family wedding. And just outside Windsor, Ontario, it happened. The car veered, spun, flipped, tumbled. Help arrived, the ambulance came. Her husband was injured badly enough to need hospitalization. Family was 4 hours away at best. The hospital did not allow her to stay overnight, She had no car, very little cash, no credit card, and ATMs were not yet a thing. So what to do? She sat in the waiting room, considering her options, and sobbed. Now, a woman on the other side of the waiting room, a kind-looking woman with light brown hair and a pixie haircut, looked at her, noticed her, crossed the room, sat down next to her, told her her name, and asked if she was okay. Lois was not okay. She blurted out her story, cried some more. They hugged. This ordinary-seeming white Canadian woman and the young African-American woman with a big afro at that time and torn clothing, and she says probably still glass in her hair, they hugged. And the woman said, "How can I help?" Which is such a simple question, but it's not a simple question at all, is it, when you're asking it to a stranger in need? In the end, Lewis says, the woman showed wild kindness. She drove her to a hotel, prepaid the bill, but first she stopped at a McDonald's, got her something to eat, and at a drugstore so she could pick up all her essentials. Then she came back in the morning, picked her up, drove her to the insurance company, the bank, and the rental car agency. Who was this woman? Had she been at the hospital visiting a friend? Was her beloved in the hospital suffering? Was she maybe an off-duty nurse or doctor or social worker? Lewis somehow never found out. But the woman showed up for her and extended wild compassion without any idea that she would one day end up in a book and a sermon from a major Manhattan pulpit and a Portland pulpit. What she has done will be told in memory of her, and we don't even know her name. The stories don't always come out this well, as we know from the Oregonian. Helping strangers can be risky business. Being a stranger in need of help is risky business. Over the years, we have occasionally paid for motel rooms for people faced with sleeping out on the street. Some years ago, I put someone up in a motel. They were in between situations and needed just 2 nights covered, and I knew this to be true. And had we not covered the 2 nights, this person would have been out on the street, which would have been particularly dangerous for them. I got out my credit card, feeling very much like the Good Samaritan, who, you remember, said he would cover any costs that were incurred. And motels no longer take cash from third parties. I don't know if you know this. Once you pay for a room with your credit card, you're guaranteeing that you will cover any extra costs. The call came deep in the middle of the first night. They'd cut their foot badly and bled all over the carpet, all over the bed, the curtains, the mattress. The police were called, a fight ensued, the tenant evicted, the room ruined. You're probably asking yourself 2 questions. What happened to that person? I don't know. I never found out. We were in contact via cell phone until their phone died, and I was never able to find that person again. You're also probably wondering, how much does it cost to redo a motel room? I never found that out either. When I was finally able to reach the clerk later in that week, the clerk responsible for the building, she said, "Oh, we won't charge you for that." What? What? This was a major corporation. And now I think, who was the real Good Samaritan in this story? It was the motel clerk. And to this day, I say a prayer of thanks for her every time I pass the Motel 6 on Powell Boulevard. Around Thanksgiving time, just before the pandemic began, I got an email from a church in Southern California. A young Honduran man, an asylum seeker that this church had been helping out, was moving to Portland and needed a place to live for just 2 months. Did we have anybody in our church who could help? Who could open up their home? And I thought, oh, that's a big ask. But you never know, so I'll ask. And beginning of the service that Sunday, I asked, and from behind me, Nell Whitman, who was lay reader that day, said, I can do that. And she did. Once the pandemic hit, 2 months stretched into 2+ years, one person became 2 people and lately became 4 people. And Nell ushered those young men through learning to drive, getting their permits, their licenses, navigating the intricacies of legal paperwork in a different country, and so much more. In return, she had interesting company during the quarantine, expanded her world, greatly improved her Spanish. I've told her many a time, if we had an award for Mother of the Year, I would have nominated her. I asked her permission to share this story today, and she said, well, be sure, though, that you point out that it wasn't like a heroic leaping to my feet. This was something I'd been thinking about. She'd been thinking about how she could share her house for a long time. She'd been preparing for it. And she said, it's important to know what you can do, what you want to do, and then watch for the opportunity to do it. She said she believes most people can do most anything for 2 months. And as 2 months have led into 2+ years, and now all the young men are in their own home, she said it's also important to know when you've overdone it, too. Jackie Lewis reflects on the Good Samaritan story and says, if you want to know what love looks like, Rabbi Jesus is saying, here it is. Love crosses borders and boundaries. It makes new cultural rules. It cares for the stranger. Love turns strangers, in fact, into friends. Fierce love is rule-breaking, border-crossing, and extravagant kindness that increases our circle. What if we took more risks? What if we got outside our comfort zones a little more often? What if next time you see a woman with a hijab, you smile with your eyes and with your heart? What if you see those new people at church and nobody's talking to them, but you haven't seen your friends in a week and you really need to catch up with them? Can't somebody else go meet them? Go talk to them. They could become your new best friends. Those kids with the skateboards and the baggy pants, don't cross the street. Say hi to them. Be curious about their lives. Maybe you'll open up a different kind of space between you where respect might grow and where even relationship might eventually blossom. This fierce love could change your world. And sometimes you'll be the one extending the love. Sometimes you'll be the one receiving the love. You never know when that might happen. One time, an older woman in this church broke her hip, and she wound up in a rehab center. No one wants to wind up in a rehab center, right? And I suspected that this woman would be particularly unhappy about it. Well, I walked in the room, and she was beaming. She said, everyone here is so interesting. They're all from different countries. I'm getting to know nurses from Guatemala and the Philippines. There's a beautiful man from Cameroon who comes into my room every night and cleans, and he sings to me. Somehow she had opened up a different kind of space than I had expected, and she was able to receive extravagant kindness and increase her world. So a seminary classmate of mine named Dorothy Kipp shared a story in a sermon that I have never forgotten. I hung on to a copy of the sermon, a paper copy, for a long time. I've shared it in sermons quite a bit, not for a while here. And it's now long lost, but I think I can summon most of it up. Dorothy began, she said, the beautifully embossed envelope from the White House was addressed to my son, Rob. I could not imagine why they were writing him. I knew that Rob was wonderful, but I was puzzled how President Nixon also knew. I was on pins and needles until Rob came home that day from school. He took one look at the envelope, grabbed it, headed for his room, and shut the door. It took all my 12 years of knowing him to finally lure him out. A letter from the president. What did it say? I asked. Nothing. But the president, Rob, surely he said something. Nothing. He eventually succumbed to all of my motherly wheedling skills and handed me the letter. Dear Rob, I am sorry that I cannot fulfill your request to be transferred out of Horace Mann Elementary School. The president went on to say that he realized that life can be unjust, but there are some things that simply must be faced head on and endured, and so on and so on. Rob, Dorothy asked, what's going on that you want to leave your school? Nothing. So Dorothy went to visit the teacher. There in the classroom was an almost perfect circle of all the students' desks. But 2 desks sat outside of the circle. One belonged to a boy who wore ratty clothes and didn't bathe often, and the other was Rob's. The teacher explained that the first boy's desk was out there because he smelled bad, and the other kids didn't want to sit near him. Rob had moved his desk out of the circle to sit next to him. It didn't make sense, she said, but Rob was always doing weird things like that. So what did Rob accomplish? Nothing. He didn't get his transfer out of Horace Mann Elementary School. But as the 6th grade prophet of Horace Mann Elementary, he called out the unjust power arrangements of his society. He moved outside of the comfortable arrangements of class and status to accompany the outsider. Dorothy ended her sermon, and I'll end mine, quoting Jesus describing the great sorting out that is envisioned at the end of times. When the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will separate people from one another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats, and he will put the sheep at his right and the goats at his left. Then he will say to the sheep at his right, come, you who are blessed by your God and mine, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the beginning of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you welcomed me. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Then the sheep will answer him, Lord, when was it that we saw you hungry and gave you food, or thirsty and gave you drink? When was it that we saw you a stranger and welcomed you, or sick and took care of you? And the answer will come, truly I tell you, as you did it to the least of these, you did it to me.